today, as an organization, you sit on all this data and you have all this interconnected world that actually cannot connect to each other that well. Because if you look at how much money has gone into only final mile logistics or ocean visibility, but now if I'm a freight forwarder or a shipper that wants to use multiple of those, I have to now use 10 different systems, right? So there's an element of having a logistics API that cuts across all of that and has the interoperability of data. Second is, we are still very human driven, but we want humans to do more and more upgraded tasks, which is where RPA comes in and hyper optimization. And intelligent virtual assistants are the future in that game, where they are not chatbots, they are highly intelligent AI and ML driven algorithms that will learn our industry's terminology and help take decisions that are capable to be done at this stage.
Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you are new to our channel, please consider subscribing to it and hit the bell icon so that you never miss an update. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very accomplished entrepreneur from Dubai, Mr. Abhishek Shah. Abhishek, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. My pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Abhishek is the CEO and co-founder of RSA Global, which is a digital freight forwarding and supply chain provider in the UAE. It is a logistics solutions company. Abhishek has also founded ByTasker and FER.ai. He's a member of the YPO, EO, and he's from the Harvard Business School. What an amazing journey you've had at such a young age. So Abhishek, let's talk about RSA Global. And, I've often said that supply chains haven't got their so-called place in the sun in the corporate world, but it's suddenly being talked about from President Biden to Prime Minister Modi. Everyone's talking supply chains. So let's start with your telling me, what is a digital freight forwarding and supply chain?
Yeah, so again, thanks so much. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Unfortunately, because of COVID, supply chains did come to the front end of how the world had to operate and keep moving, and I think the appreciation came as a result of that. But I mean, to your question of digital freight forwarding, it really has to do with a industry that has not changed in terms of the aspect of getting freight or product from point A to point B. How it changed, the mode of transport, by road, by sea, by air, by rail, whatever it might be. But just how that transaction happens. And I think one of those really big facts was a single shipment could have changed between 15 to 27 hands right the way through its entire journey, right? So digital freight forwarding is basically making that much simpler, much cleaner, much more, bringing all those collaborators into one platform, because by nature of supply chain and global organizations, you're just going to have many people at the table to execute. So how do you make them collaborate very well together? So I think that's really what digital is about. It's making that simple. Then you add in payments, you add in financing, you add in communication, and you add in a whole bunch of things that are all enabling trade to basically happen. And so at the end of the day, you're supporting global trade. And that's really what supply chain is.
Fantastic. And tell me about the scope of work you handle at RSA Global.
Yeah, so RSA started in 2012 as a family organization that my dad and I started together, and we started out in the contract logistics, which is sort of the warehousing, the four-wall operations, and having very specific industry focuses when it came to automotive spare parts, to petrochemicals, to frozen logistics, and more recently now e-commerce fulfillment. And we are a fully fledged service provider when it comes to that. So an end-to-end supply chain solution. So your freight forwarding or moving product by any mode, to storing and distributing and customs and brokerage and reporting and the whole like. So you have to now today be a fully integrated provider to be able to really solve the customer's problem. So we do that across multiple geographies of the Middle East, East Africa, India, and Hong Kong and China. And that's sort of where we have our breadth of expertise.
Interesting. And, you're running your own business, but I wanted to ask you that, when I was a young individual in the corporate world, we used to have a purchase manager. And over the last 3-4 decades, it's evolved into a C-suite executive. And I'm told that in large numbers of companies, the chief supply chain officer is delivering more profits than the head of marketing. Question to you is, how have you seen the function evolve?
Yeah. So I don't have the decades to show. I've got 12 years to show you.
Yeah.
But in my view, it's supply chain has become a competitive advantage for
Mhm.
shippers, right? So if you're a cargo owner, if you're a brand, sometimes your delivery, route to market, access to markets, and sometimes speed to market differentiates you. And I think that now has an opportunity when you reverse engineer that to actually have an ability to create more profitability or revenue to the game. And I think Amazon's a great example of that. Zara and Inditex are a great example of that, right? Their speed of supply chain gave them a competitive edge, and now that's changed habits of the consumer globally.
Okay.
And in my 10 years, I think the biggest thing that I've seen change is that from in a point where it was always hub and spoke, right? That now you have to have this very varied channels of distribution, that you have to have a very resilient and flexible supply chain at the same time to be able to manage all of those, right? So you're doing B2B, B2B2C, B2C, and you're doing then the traditional business as well. So having all of those, having the tech behind you to manage all of that is really what's now the demand of the customer.
Fascinating. And we just very briefly mentioned the pandemic and its impact on supply chains. But my question to you, Abhishek, is that over the last 18 odd months, the entire world has been impacted because of the pandemic. What innovations or what corrections have supply chains had to make because deliveries have become faster? So I'd love to get your perspective.
So I think there's a varied view here, right? If you're not in the supply chain world and you're only a consumer of e-commerce product, you see that speed is the most important thing to you. Opportunity of choice to choose from products is important to you. You don't really know what happens beyond that, right? But from the supply chain perspective, there's multiple aspects that have had to adapt and change. So one, there's a segment of industry that you might be in. So for example, food logistics became exceptionally important as every country around the world looked to make sure they had enough supplies for the population. And that meant frozen logistics versus the quick service restaurants that completely shut down. You had a very large imbalance in sort of how you had to manage it, right? But then you had, for example, e-commerce and cross-border logistics, which became extremely expensive because air freight rates went up, but the consumer still wanted it on time. So all these dynamics in the back end have had a dramatic shift in, and it's still not over, to be honest. The pandemic happened. Then, for example, you had the Suez Canal crisis happen. Then you had, now China is back in challenge with COVID in the South China ports. And that is having dramatic ripple effects across the globe, right? So by nature of it, supply chain at least my philosophy is, build everything with a max amount of flexibility that you can do. In all of our assets that we develop, physical and digital, it is about as much flexibility as you can build because we just don't know what tomorrow brings. And when we sit down and talk to our customers, they're like, honestly, we are evolving our strategy. We're still developing what we think the post-pandemic world is going to be about. So it's now about understanding how you build flexibility, but also resilience with the relationship. And I think that's the biggest tug of war that you have, because sometimes those two can't be said in the same sentence.
Absolutely. And you speak of resilience. I'm going to ask you about mitigating of risk, but before that, I wanted to understand from you. You work in multiple countries, multiple continents. Till recently, we were a borderless world, but now suddenly borders are coming up all over the world. How does that impact supply chains?
So, if you go back and my macro view of what has changed most in the last 10 to 15 years that has allowed supply chain to become, if I can say it, sexy to the outside world and venture capital money, is that two main things happened, right? The rise of e-commerce, which showed that there was a huge blue ocean of opportunity. Second, it was the carriers or shipping lines and airlines becoming more technology forward and allowing you to have access to information of where product was, coupled with entry into countries, which today there's 200 countries, there's 200 ways that has to happen. There's no standardization. I don't think we will ever have standardization for that, right? Because customs and each country is unique on that. So I think that when you look at that, it is so important to have the right sort of technology flow to be able to manage in that flow of cross-border logistics, which today cannot be rejigged. There's lots of talk of more local sourcing and more local manufacturing, but that will have a small percentage of reallocation or redistribution of manufacturing, but not the majority in my view. Still, China, India, Mexico, Latin America will be the powerhouses of production, right? And they will still need to export to the majority of the world.
Right.
But the one thing the pandemic showed is that it doesn't matter what happens with the people side, but trade can't stop, and no cargo was ever stopped during that period, right? And that was because we all depend on it, and our livelihoods are dependent on it, of whether it be food or necessities, and then there's obviously the nice to haves. So I think that's my view on how
absolutely.
I think that will continue to change.
Very well said. And again, in a situation where there are so much turmoil going on in the world because of the pandemic, how do you, or as a supply chain head or a logistics company or a supply chain manager, how do people mitigate risk?
So this is the big question now, because you don't know which way to go, right? But I think there's a few steps you can do. So one is that there's a beautiful Harvard case study where they showed, of all the component parts to create a car, right? There was one single supplier in one city in, I think, Taiwan, that was creating this part that entirely stopped the entire production line for a whole company, right? So I think going through your supply base and having a look at the risk that they have and the impact that they can have is one aspect, right? And so that includes sort of multi-product sourcing opportunities versus single product sourcing, which I think most companies do anyway. But when you had that same company with different factories, but they were still not able to get a product to you, what do you do? Secondly is, how do you build, again, with flexibility and making sure you have forward stock locations, right? So you may now have a upstream stock system where I produce and I hold everything there, and as per my customers' orders, I will then ship out. Now we're seeing the opportunity of much more forward stock locations coming into play. Let's hold it closer to the market. So once it's in there, it can then be redistributed. Of course, you've got to work with your shelf lives, etc. And the third thing is, how do you invest better in your systems or your supply chain partners to give you enough data upstream so you know what's happening with inventory movements, consumption patterns, so you can make better buying decisions as a whole of how much inventory to put in each location. And I think there's certain hubs around the world, whether it be Singapore, Dubai, Rotterdam, and parts of the US, that can help you serve the rest of the world as a whole, depending on where your product and your market is.
Wonderful. So one more question before I come to technology in supply chains is that, because of the pandemic, the consumer has got used to a 30-minute delivery for food and food products. And because of organizations like Amazon Prime, they got used to delivery in one day or the following day. What is so therefore customer expectations have changed completely. How will supply chains re-engineer themselves to meet such incredible demands?
So, my view on this is that until maybe the last one and a half year, that model from a balance sheet and profit and loss perspective is unsustainable by nature, because it was not covering the cost. And who was paying for that? The investor was paying for that, right? Into that. And of course, there's been a very big push of what's the road to profitability and economies of scale, and building towards that, which I think is happening now, and you can see it. And that's why the supply chain technology market is so hot today, because people have seen that this is a opportunity, there's critical mass, it's a habit that's not going away, pandemic only accelerated it. But still today, how do you make money? I'm a little bit old school like that, where profit still is something I endeavor to create in all of my ventures. Okay. But somebody eventually has to pay for that. So if it's not going to be the investor in the future, and you're optimizing only to go so far, at the end of the day, the consumer will have to pay for it, right? And when the consumer has to pay for it, it'll come to an element of choice. And where I think the world is going to go to is the consumer is now going to have multiple options of 30-minute delivery, 2-day delivery, 7-day delivery, right? So it's going to be first class, premium economy, and economy. What do you now want to choose? It's really up to you. And I think that power of choice is where that habit is going to build. And that same habit of us as an individual consumer buying is moving now into the B2B world.
Right.
B2B e-commerce, in my view, is the next 10 years of tremendous growth. And because we are all used to that kind of UI and experience, but still we have paper-based POs and a whole bunch of phone calls to basically get my paper to the company that I need to print for every month, right? And I think that's the thing that's going to change very much when it comes to B2B e-commerce as well. And that can be a 1-day, 2-day, 3-day delivery. I don't think there's an issue with that.
Fascinating. So your response gives me the right segue to the next question, which is on technology. I mean, again, many years ago, or as late as maybe 10, 12 years ago, technology in supply chains was a good ERP, right? And people
Right.
said, "Oh, we've got a very, very modern supply chain." But today, there's artificial intelligence, there's machine learning going on. There are robotics are being used, drones are being used. So my question to you, Abhishek, is what is technology doing to supply chain, and how are you, as an organization, adapting to all these new technologies for logistics?
Yeah, so if I go back to that macro element there, right, those
Yeah.
two big changes
Mm,
accelerated why technology came into supply chain because
mm,
global trade was too complicated to solve and it's too large to solve. But
mm,
when these elements of data points opened up because of e-commerce and the big sort of holders of black spots, whether the carriers and customs, they all started now allowing you to have open APIs or access to information.
mhm,
You now had ability to actually provide visibility, which is one thing that everybody wanted. Then it moves on to, okay, what can I do with that data now once I have it with more predictive analytics and
mm,
how do I manage my downstream supply chain? This was when the world was fully just in time, right? Which now the pandemic may have changed slightly
correct.
with holding more stock than you need.
Mhm,
Um, and what everyone realized is supply chain is so data rich, right? It's so data rich, but that data needs to be curated and nurtured into a way that AI and data scientists can actually really work with.
mm,
And our approach has been that today, as an organization, you sit on all this data and you have all this interconnected world that actually cannot connect to each other that well.
mm,
Because if you look at how much money has gone into only final mile logistics or ocean visibility, but now if I'm a freight forwarder or a shipper that wants to use multiple of those, I have to now use 10 different systems,
mm,
right? So there's an element of having a logistics API that cuts across all of that and has the interoperability of data. Second is we are still very human driven, but we want humans to do more and more upgraded tasks, which is where RPA comes in and hyper optimization. And intelligent virtual assistants are the future in that game where they are not chatbots, they are highly intelligent AI and ML driven algorithms
mhm,
that will learn our industry's terminology and help take decisions that are capable to be done at this stage. And when you combine all that put together, you're actually increasing a lot of efficiency. You're allowing humans to go on and do more value addition tasks in an organization. And that's been our approach till date. We haven't gone so much into automation of robotics and drones because I
mhm,
think that still regulation really has to be caught up in our parts of the world where we're operating in that. But on the software and the data front, there's so much that can be done today, which is open source that is in our game. And that's where I put some of my own personal time and interest in the two companies that I've co-founded
mm.
that allows me to sort of utilize and see this in real time.
Well, that's an interesting point. I was going to ask you the next question. Tell me about the two companies you co-founded, which is ByTasker and FER.ai.
Yeah. So Bytasker and Fero are sort of both ends of playing the same game in the
Mhm,
sense that Bytasker is all about this logistics API that
mhm,
allows any shipper or any freight forwarder to seamlessly connect any of their systems together through just simple APIs and SDK kits, right? Which today is a big challenge. And it's sort of after all these systems have been created over the last 10 years, now how do we cut across them horizontally? Right. So that's really what ByTask is looking to
mhm,
solve. And digitizing with a front-end freight management tool, cross-border payments, etc. And Fero, which is at the heart of it, is an IVA, that intelligent virtual assistant, that is going to replace a lot of these mundane tasks that we all have a logistics coordinator in our company whose job is collect pricing, for example, do a little bit of analysis, and then pass it on.
mhm,
That can now be done by an IVA, and that individual can go on and do something that's going to add more value, right, as a whole. And think about that being done at computational speeds that can have so many data parameters analyzed at the same time,
mhm.
speak in multiple different languages. And today it's phenomenal what that can do. And in RSA, we call her RIA. RSA is interactive, intelligent assistant. And she's available on WhatsApp. She's available on Google Talk. And our customers, our drivers, our employees all speak to her and get all the information that they want from her.
Incredible. And that probably will change, the way supply chain down the line interacts with technology.
100%. 100%. Because today that's an independent IVA, but imagine now you put that onto your ERP, and somebody wants to, your customer wants to get their statement of account. They just talk to that IVA via WhatsApp. We're also used to typing and talking to customers today and doing business that way. It's just becoming a habit. Then the future is voice, right? We all have Siri and Alexa in our home. This will then become the next habit of me having a virtual coordinator that sits with me wherever I go in my office, and each employee gets one, right? To do all these other tasks for them. So talk about empowerment and getting more productivity from that perspective. You're talking in a very different world in 5 years from now.
Absolutely right. So, Abhishek, I'm now going to move to the next segment of our conversation, which are a few questions for you personally. And I think I have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. My first question to you is that, for someone who's achieving so much at such a young age, what would you say are 3 key milestones or pivots that you have had in your life so far or your career so far?
I think the first one there is I was extremely lucky to get a father who really allowed me to make mistakes. I mean, the kind of mistakes, I think his game was, look, money's going to come and go, right? But make sure you learn from it, right? So I think he allowed me a very free hand at a very young age, and that gave me a lot of confidence on decision making, experimentation, and how to really build and develop something. Right? So I think that was one key milestone. The second is when you're able to attract partners that really believe that you are an individual, a family, a company that we can do business with. And these are people that you're bringing to your region for the first time, or you're creating new products together and competitive advantage. And that gives you the confidence that, hey, collaboration is the way to go forward in the future, right? And you start thinking about the world differently rather than me doing everything myself or my company doing everything myself. I think that's the third one. And then the third one was going to a specific Future Forward conference in LA, and they sort of outlined the next 10 trends that they think are going to shape the next 20 years of the world.
Wow.
And then that was a very watershed moment for me where I was like, wow, I'm not involved in any of this. And it made you think back and think that I was 30 years old at the time, what am I really doing in terms of building for the future, right? Am I future-proofing my own business is number one. And 2, am I thinking and educating and learning myself to be ready for that future as a whole, right? I have 3 young daughters as well, so how am I creating a future for them? And that's what really inspired me to get into technology at that time as well.
Amazing. So my next question to you is that from where you stand today, what does success mean to Abhishek?
Yeah. So I think this is a fun question, because I think success is when I think you are able to have so much comfort and confidence of a specific amount of topic, a wealth of knowledge, that you don't really have too much of a challenge with being opposed against it, right? And I think that's where you have such wealth and knowledge that you're so comfortable that I understand the space, and that it's not something that's done. It's a continuous journey. I got to constantly keep updating, and everybody has to constantly keep updating themselves. So I think that's one aspect of success. Second is definitely going to be financial, and making sure that you set up the family and that you're building a environment that allows them to flourish with money not being a challenge for them, right? I think that's the third part. And the final, and what I really enjoy most, is I'm a people guy, right? I love being around people. I love working with people. So having people around me that I think that will just blow my mind, and I will learn from them constantly, is what stimulates me the most. And that's when I know I'm successful, because I'm able to attract people like that to come and work with me, right? And together we're going to create something amazing. So I think that talent attraction has been very recent for me, to be able to get great minds to come and work with me on different projects.
Fascinating. And my last question to you, and this is a question on failure. In fact, I've got a new book that's just come out on failure. And you did mention, your dad gave you the permission to fail, or allowed you to fail. But, in South Asia, parents don't teach children it's okay to fail.
Yeah.
You're always told, come first, head of the line, etc., etc. And that manifests itself in our behavior patterns. So my question to you, Abhishek, is what have been some of your learnings from some of your mistakes?
So I think you're right on that. I mean, we're all sort of nurtured and grow up to say that, you got to be top of the class, you got to be this. And I think I was an average student my entire life, so I think I was always to a degree, a failure in education, academics-wise, in my parents' eyes. So I was dealing with it from a young age when you had overperforming siblings and the rest, overall.
And yet you went to Harvard Business School, so
Yeah, I did a course. I didn't go
okay.
to MBA. I did a course, the OPM. I'm doing the OPM there at the moment. But people that meet me for the first time and I have to introduce my company, what I will normally end up doing is when I go through the timeline of our organization, I actually highlight my failures, right? So 2012, we went into Kenya. We went in doing the wrong business that we knew. We failed in that. 2017, we went into the cold chain industry. We mistimed the market overall, right? We went into Hong Kong. We mistimed the market. It was just pre-write-ups, right? So these are all mistakes that I made where it was about not really looking at all the data that we had, or we thought we were looking at all the data, but we then made an incorrect decision, right? So there's been so many errors like that of team members, structures. I once tried to have one company run by 3 joint general managers, right? Thinking that we're going to be a new flat hierarchical structure, and it didn't work, right? It was there had to be one boss, right? Yeah, but I so many things like that where I thoroughly enjoyed when I look back at it, but it has come at a cost, right? It has come at a cost that what we could have achieved, what we should have achieved overall. But I think that's also the luxury of being a fully private company today, and I don't think everybody has that. So again, we're fortunate in that context. I don't think you get that many chances in other circumstances.
Correct. Abhishek, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for this absolutely incredible journey you have taken me down of RSA Global, the supply chain in the world. Lots of new learnings for me. Thank you again and good luck.
Ashutosh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.